Section 5.6, the quadratic formula. If we had the equation in standard form and we used the process of completing the square with this standard form, let's see what would happen. Remember, you have to have the c on the other side. Now, and then also, so I have to subtract c. I have to move it on the other side, so subtract c. Your a has to be a 1. It has to have your x squared has to have a coefficient of 1, so we have to divide everything by a. So we get x squared plus b over ax is equal to negative c over a. Now, we have to turn this into a perfect square trinomial, and the process is taking half of b and squaring it. So I'm going to go to the side and multiply 1/2 times b over a, and you get b over 2a. And then square it, that gives you b squared over 4a squared. And that is what I add to both sides. Now again, this does not look like a perfect square trinomial, but it is. It factors into x plus, and it's always the half of b. So you go over here, and that's b over 2a. Quantity squared is equal to, now, what we're going to have to do here is we're going to have to get a common denominator. So I'm going to go to the side over here. That's negative c over a plus b squared over 4a squared. My common denominator is 4a squared. So what did I have to multiply this denominator by? A 4a. So that's what I have to multiply the numerator by. So 4a times a negative c is a negative 4ac. I didn't have to multiply this denominator by anything, so I just bring down the b squared. Now I'm going to put it over 1, and I am going to write the b squared first. So it'll say b squared minus 4ac all over 4a to the second. So that's what I'm going to write over here. B squared minus 4ac all over 4a squared. Now I'm going to do the square root property, where I take the square root of both sides, and what's inside just falls out. And you get plus or minus. I cannot take the square root of the numerator, so it stays inside the radical. But I can take the square root of the denominator. The square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of a squared is a. Now to solve for a, I am going to subtract the b over 2a. So x is equal to negative b over 2a plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And then I will put it over one denominator, which is on the next. I'm going to write this on the next panel since I don't have enough room. Well, I'll erase this. So putting this all over one denominator, that's x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And that is the quadratic formula. That is a formula that you must memorize. If you can practice deriving this formula by completing the square, you'll get extra bonus points on your test. Okay, example 1, solved by using the quadratic formula. First, the equation must be equal to 0. So put the equation equal to 0. Okay, go to this side and identify your A. Your A is the coefficient of x squared, which is 1. Your B is negative 10. And your C is negative 11. Write the formula. X equals negative B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. Always write the formula down first and then plug it into the formula. Negative B, that's a negative 10, which is positive 10, plus or minus B squared, that's negative 10 squared. Go ahead and do that mentally. What is negative 10 squared? It's 100. Minus 4 times 1 times C is negative 11. Now notice I put negative 11 in parentheses because anytime you're multiplying by a negative 11, you should enclose it in parentheses. And then 2 times A is 1, so 2 times 1 is just 2. Okay, next step is you want to rewrite the x equals 10 plus or minus the square root and bring down the b squared, which is 100. Now what I want you to do is I want you to circle this negative 4ac. So circle it right here. It helps keep your eyes focused on the negative signs because this is where people make their mistake. Negative 4 times 1 times a negative 11 is a positive 44 all over 2. So that's x equals 10 plus or minus 144 over 2. 144 is 12. Now, if you can take the square root, you need to now separate it. You have two separate answers. 10 plus 12 over 2, and x is equal to 10 minus 12 over 2. 10 plus 12 is 22 over 2, which is 11. And 10 minus 12 is a negative 2 over 2 is negative 1. So there are your two answers. Example 1b, we have to get this equation equal to 0. Go to the side and identify your A. A is 1, B is 6, and C is negative 16. Write the formula down. Negative B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. So that's negative 6 plus or minus B squared, that's 36, minus 4 times 1 times a negative 16 all over 2 times 1 is 2. Now copy the x equals negative 6 plus or minus, copy down your b squared, which is 36. Stop and go back right here and circle this so that that'll keep your eyes on the negative. Negative times negative is a positive, and 4 times 16 is 64. So it's a plus 64 over 2. And 36 plus 64 is 100 over 2. And 100, the square root of 100 is 10. So we have to separate this to two separate answers. Negative 6 plus 10 over 2, which is 4 over 2, and 4 over 2 is 2. And then x is equal to negative 6 minus 10 over 2, which is negative 16 over 2, which is negative 8. So there are your two answers. Negative 2 and negative 8. Example 2, solve by using the quadratic formula. Use the graphing calculator to show the graph. Okay, remember, when you're solving for x, you are finding the x-intercepts, which is also called the roots, which is also called the zeros. It is already equal to 0, so let's identify our a is 1, our b is 8, and our c is 16. Once again, write the formula down. The more times you write the formula, you'll have it memorized. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Save some room, I'm going to squeeze it up here. That's negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 8 squared is 64 minus 4 times 1 times 16. I'm running out of room. All over 2 times 1 is 2. So that says x is equal to negative 8 plus or minus 64. Go up here and circle this. That's negative 4 times 1 times, that's a 16 in case you can't read my handwriting. And that is a negative 64 over 2. 64 minus 64 is 0. So that's negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 0 over 2. Well, square root of 0 is 0. So that's x is equal to negative 8 over 2, which is negative 4. Now what happens if you go to graph this in your calculator, it's going to look, that's the x-intercept, which is negative 4, 0. It's going to look something like this, which the x-intercept is also your vertex. So that is a quadratic with only one solution. Example 3, we're going to identify our a is 2, b is 6, c is negative 7. Write the formula down. Let's plug into the formula. That's negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 6 squared is 36 minus 4 times a is 2 times c is negative 7 all over 2 times a is 2, so 2 times 2 is 4. So x is equal to negative 6 plus or minus 36. Now right here, go back here and multiply, circle. That's negative 4 times 2 times negative 8. Well, that's a negative times, negative 4 and a negative 7 is a positive, so I know it's going to be positive. 4 times 2 is 8, 8 times 7 is 56. All over 4. So that's x is equal to negative 6 plus or minus 36 plus 56 is 92 over 4. Okay, now I can't take the square root of 92, So what I need to do is try to see if I can break that down. 92 is 4 times 23. So that's x is equal to negative 6 plus or minus square root of 4 is 2. Cannot take the square root of 23, so it stays inside the radical over 4. Now, we have a fraction, so what we need to do is split each term over its own denominator. So that's negative 6 over 4 plus or minus 2 square root of 23 over 4. Now we can reduce. Negative 6 over 4, that's negative 3 over 2, plus or minus, and 2 goes into 4 2 times, so that's square root of 23 over 2. You can leave it like that, or it's also written back over one denominator. Negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 23 over 4. Either answer is acceptable, and you need to know that that is the same thing. Example 3b, we have to identify our A. Our B is 5, and our C is 1. First thing we do is write the formula down. Okay, now let's plug it in. Negative B, that's 5, so that's negative 5, plus or minus B squared, that's 5 squared is 25, minus 4, times A is 3, and C is 1. Kind of can't see that. All over 2 times 3 is 6. So that's x equals negative 5 plus or minus 25. Right here, go and multiply. That's negative, or go and circle. That's negative 4 times 3 times 1. That's a negative 12. All over 6. So x is equal to negative 5 plus or minus 25 minus 12 is 13 over 6. Now, I cannot simplify the square root of 13, and I know that if I go to split it and put each term over its own denominator, there's nothing I can do. I cannot reduce it. So that's not even necessary. I'm just done right here. So sometimes you can simplify more further and sometimes you can't. Example 4, we have to get this equation equal to 0. So I'm going to add 10. Identify A as 1, B is negative 6, and C is 10. Okay, that's negative B, and B is negative 6, so that's negative a negative 6, which is 6, plus or minus. Negative 6 squared is a positive 36, minus 4 times A is 1, and C is 10. All over 2 times 1 is 2. So that's x equals 6 plus or minus 36. Go over here and multiply. Negative 4 times 1 times 10 is a negative 40. So it's a minus 40 over 2. 6 plus or minus. 36 minus 40 is a negative 4 over 2. Now, when you have a negative inside the radical, that is an imaginary number. So that's 6 plus or minus the square root of negative 4 is 2i over 2. Now separate, put each term over its own denominator so that you can reduce. So 6 over 2 is 3 plus or minus 2 over 2 is 1, so that's 1i, or we can just say I. And that is the answer. Example 4b. Identify your A is 3, your B is 5, and your C is 4. Once again, write the formula down. Plug into the formula. -5 plus or minus the square root of 5 squared, that's 25, minus 4 times 3, and C is 4 times 4. All over 2 times A, which is 3, so 2 times 3 is 6. X equals, bring down the -5, plus or minus, square root of 25. So now go over here and circle. That's -4 times 3 times, that's a times 4. Okay, that's going to be a negative. 4 times 3 is 12, and 12 times 4 is 48. So it's a minus 48 over 6. 25 minus 48 is a -23 over 6.